Number 19, 2 Kings, in the series The Picture of God in All 66 by Graham Maxwell, recorded November 1983.
Kings, and think of all the money you're saving by coming to meeting instead of shopping for Christmas. Next time, I think we should do 1st and 2nd Chronicles together, though. If we find it's too much, we can spread it out over the next 2 weeks. But Chronicles is really a review of Samuel and Kings, and it would be well to read both of them if you can. In fact, in the beginning, they were regarded as one book anyway. One single book. In reading Chronicles, there's much that might seem to be repetitious and reminds one of the Gospels. Much is repeated in the Gospels, much is repeated in Chronicles. What then do you think the important difference might be that would merit the inclusion of this large volume that the Septuagint calls the things that remain, the things left over? And there are many additional details in there. The difference is important. For example, the reason given, the explanation given for King Saul's death and failure. There's more on that in Chronicles. And his suicide. It says that thus God slew him. A very important part of the accumulating evidence as to the meaning of these phrases, that God has done something, God has sent an evil spirit, or God has slain somebody. And then who is it that tempted David to number Israel? You remember the story in Samuel? Chronicles says it was Satan. Samuel says it was God. Now, how can we reconcile the two, taking the Bible as a whole and not choosing one part over another? You might note, if you wish, particularly the close of 2 Chronicles, chapter 36, verses 15 and 16, where it says how God persistently sent his prophets and how the people turned him down century after century until finally God had to let them go, because it says there was no remedy. It's not arbitrary. There simply was nothing more he could do. Now, what does that say about God? All these hundreds of years, he's worked with these descendants of Abraham, and he certainly had some friends along the way. But by and large, he, in terms of numbers, doesn't seem to be too successful. Why do you understand God persisted in working with these people for so long? I mean, what is God's purpose? And even when he brings them back from captivity, they don't seem to do much better. And finally, he sends his son, and they kill him. So what is God really trying to accomplish? What is his mission on this planet before the eyes of the onlooking universe? And do we have any indication as to how the universe has been interpreting this? What has it said to them? Has it made the universe more or less secure that God has treated the descendants of Abraham the way he did all those centuries? Incidentally, in the introduction to 1 Chronicles in the Adventist Bible Commentary, there's a very fine list of differences between Kings and Chronicles. Very nicely arranged. It'll say, whereas such and such a story is told this way in Kings, this additional information or this difference is apparent in Chronicles. That's as nice an arrangement as you could ask for, right there in the Bible Commentary. But now tonight, 2 Kings. From the death of Ahab clear down to the Babylonian captivity. You'll notice in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles doesn't end with them in captivity, but with permission to come home. It goes just a little further. Just as Chronicles starts back further in the other direction, it even begins with Adam. At the very beginning of 2 Kings, the leader of God's chosen people in the promised land, the king of Israel, is inquiring of Beelzebub, the god of flies. Would you think that circumstances in our church had come to a pretty sorry pass if we knew that the president of the General Conference was consulting Beelzebub, the god of flies, to determine the course of affairs for our church? Well, so it was in the land of Israel. But even in those days, Elijah was ready to be translated. How could there be such a good man under such forbidding circumstances? First, though, there is the story of the burning of the 50. You remember those groups that came? and fire came down from heaven and consumed them. Do you remember when the disciples were displeased that people were not attending Jesus' evangelistic meetings, and they said, would you like us to pray as Elijah did? And we have the text for it right here, that God would send fire down from heaven and burn up these people? You remember Christ's reply? I haven't come to destroy, I've come to save. Well, what's the difference between that and the Old Testament? He was forever surprising the disciples, wasn't he? And surprising the Pharisees when they brought the woman to him, taken in adultery, and said, we've got the text for this, she should be stoned, and he didn't agree with them. He often puzzled them in this way. How are we supposed to understand this man who was almost ready to be translated, and he prays, and fire comes down from heaven and consumes them? What's the difference? Then there are the many exploits of Elisha, the many miracles. And of course the she-bears that came when the boys were irreverent. He even is instrumental in resurrecting someone. And then you remember the story of death in the pot. Do you have certain feeling about some verses in the Bible? I do. I mean, verses that have been used in our family, for example. Like way over in John, if a man say, I love God, but he hates his brother, he's a liar. Since I grew up with 3 brothers and I was the oldest, my mother used to use that from time to time. So every time I read it, I have a special feeling about that verse. And then over in Proverbs where it says, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. My father used to use that. He'd come into our bedroom in the morning. His metabolism was just unusual anyway. He liked to arise a great while before I thought he should. And he'd come into our room and say, yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep, and so on. Then in Thessalonians, you remember the verse that if a man work not, neither shall he eat. I remember my father sending that to me in the mail one time. So some verses we have special associations with. Well, there's death in the pot is another one. When health reform first came to England, my grandfather, who was a very healthy person already, possessing extraordinary vigor, he died in his mid-90s. He didn't need to. His ailment wasn't that serious. He just couldn't bear to go to the hospital and eat the food there, which he thought would not really be quite up to standard. 2 meals a day, push-ups, chin-ups, that's the way Grandpa was. And so he immediately espoused the health reform message, But the rest of the family was a little behind him. And so my mother tells of Grandpa coming home one day and smelling something in the kitchen and removing the lid and looking on and saying, oh, there's death in the pot. There's death in the pot. So I have a feeling about that verse too. Now, husbands, tomorrow noon, don't lift the lid and say to your wife, there's death in the pot. Use that with great tact. And then the miracle of the endless oil and the endless bread, it reminds us of as the endless meal, the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, the healing of Naaman, then the story of Jehu, who's given his name to people who drive rather rapidly, and then the death of Jezebel. And the first mention of cosmetics in the Bible? Well, it does say she painted her eyes and her face and looked out the window. And I remember that being used in college days up at PUC, when maybe the women's dormitory dean was looking for a verse as a basis for a worship talk, and she liked this one. It was Jezebel. You wouldn't want to be like Jezebel, would you, girls? She painted her face and her eyes and looked out the window. And then good King Jehoash's reforms, and in a succession of evil kings. And then the story of Kings Rezin and Pekah, the background for Isaiah 7:14, and we surely ought to spend some time on that. And then the northern tribes are taken away by Assyria. And nobody knows where they are to this day for sure. There are many theories as to where they are. That's why the prophets so often say someday God will bring them all home. All 12 tribes will be together again. But the only mention I know of them being together is in Revelation, where it speaks of the 144,000, all 12 together. And that includes all of us if we wish. And then Hezekiah's experience, we should look at that. Manasseh's evil reign and how he came back at the end. Then Josiah's reforms, associated with Bible study, as is so often the case in Scripture. And then that leads up to 2 Kings 23, verse 24. It's good King Josiah that we're reading about. Josiah put away the mediums and the wizards and the teraphim and the idols and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem. That means they were there. And you wonder why God had to let his people go? Well, if a good king had to clean all this out, that indicates the condition of the people as a whole. So verse 25, it says, "Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Nor did any like him arise after him. Still, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him, though Manasseh died a repentant king." It suggests this can't be arbitrary. It's just there are consequences. Even under a good king, God could not reverse everything. If he were a manipulating God, he could have done this. And it's true, much of this evil developed under Manasseh. Manasseh repented in the end and sought to repair some of the damage done, but it was too late. If this were arbitrary, God could say, well, now you're behaving and I'll bless you. No, there are consequences. Even though one be forgiven, there are consequences. And the Lord said, "I will remove Judah out of my sight, as I have already removed Israel." They'd already gone into I'm going to say captivity. It's almost oblivion. "And I will cast off this city which I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house of which I said, my name shall be there." Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Now where's that book? Is that the next two volumes, the next book? Did you notice references to many books through here? In fact, it's been estimated that there's mention of about 24 books that we may not have. See, there's no statement we have everything that was ever written under inspiration, necessarily. We have the 66, there may have been others. And it was not necessarily a book written under inspiration. It was a record, a history, a chronicle. But there is mention made of many other books that were available. Maybe some of these will turn up someday. This would remind us, that verse 28, of the last words of Chronicles for next time. Maybe to read them now, and it shows the similarity. In 2 Chronicles 36:15, 2 Chronicles 36:15, "The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words, and scoffing at his prophets, till the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, till there was no remedy, and he let them go." But now, how does God feel when he lets people go? Well, we need to read Hosea, and he's already prophesied before this. See, all these prophets with their appeals and their persuasions, most of them have come before this time. One of them is Jeremiah. In fact, he's prophesying right through this period. What did the king do with the messages from Jeremiah? Remember, cut them up and threw them in the fire and threw Jeremiah in the pit. Now, the prophets were not taken very seriously, and this records that. Now, what shall we pick in 2 Kings as accumulating evidence as to the kind of person God is? How about Elisha's treatment of the Syrians when they came in chapter 6? You remember how that story develops dramatically there? Say, starting with chapter 6, verse 8. "Once when the king of Syria was warring against Israel, he took counsel with his servants, saying, 'At such and such a place shall be my camp.' But the man of God," that's Elisha, isn't it? Elijah's follower, "sent word to the king of Israel, 'Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are going down there.' And the king of Israel sent to the place of which the man of God told him. Thus he used to warn him, so that he saved himself there more than once or twice. And the mind of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing. And he called his servants and said to them, "Will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel?" And one of his servants said, "None, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedchamber." And he said, "Go and see where he is, that I may send and seize him." It was told him, "Behold, he is in Dothan." So he sent their horses and chariots and a great army. He was taking Elisha seriously, wasn't he? Sent a whole army for him. And they came by night and surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was round about the city. And the servant said, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" He said, "Fear not, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Then Elisha prayed and said, "O Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see." So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. You know, if Israel had only believed that from the beginning, they never would have fought their way into Canaan, would they? But they didn't have confidence in this, and so they insisted on protecting themselves and doing their own fighting. Isn't this part of the evidence as to the way God would like to have looked after people all along? In the case of Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem, how did 185,000 soldiers die that night? Did the Israelites kill them? God took care of them, as he did the armies of Egypt. It would have been much better to leave it up to God. But they preferred to look after themselves, so he helped them look after themselves. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, "Strike this people, I pray thee, with blindness." So he struck them with blindness, in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, "This is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek." And he led them to Samaria. Now, did he lie? This is Elisha, you know. Ellen White says Elisha was just as eligible for translation as was Elijah. And by the way, why did he not enjoy that marvelous experience? She makes the comment, Elisha died of a lingering illness, and the way he behaved during that illness demonstrated something else God wanted to say, and Elisha was willing to let God say through him whatever he wished. He was not jealous of Elijah. Whatever the Lord wishes to do was all right with him. But how could a man as good as Elisha say this? How do you explain that? Maybe we should read on down. In fact, always when there's a problem, the best advice is to read on. As soon as they entered Samaria, Elisha said, "O Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see." So the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw. And lo, they were in the midst of Samaria. And guess who was right there? Both Elisha and the king. I mean, he didn't lie to escape, did he, at all? He was right there. And when the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, "My father, shall I slay them? Shall I slay them?" I mean, he could hardly wait to do it. What an opportunity. And Elisha answered, "You shall not slay them. Would you slay those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master." And apparently the king thought this was a good idea because he didn't just give them bread and water. The king prepared for them a great feast. And when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. And the Syrians came no more on raids into the land of Israel. I wonder if anybody's reading that text in the Middle East right now. How would it be if they did this to the Syrians? You know, this is like reading 1983, isn't it? Can you imagine? I don't know whether it would work now, but this is the coals of fire approach of the New Testament, the turning of the other cheek. It worked back then. It's a wonderful story. It's almost they live happily ever after. The Syrians came no more on raids into the land of Israel. Isn't that a bright story in the midst of so much warfare and intrigue?
The enemies of Israel spared when most of the time, if they were spared, God was angry. He said to go ahead and hew them to pieces. Later, when one of the kings went to fight against one of the Syrian kings and was supposed to kill him and didn't. I think it was Ahaz that got in trouble for that.
Well, King Saul, hadn't killed King Agag, and so Samuel hewed him in pieces before the Lord, you remember. Now Elisha is saying you wouldn't kill them if you brought them captive, would you?
Saul didn't do him either.
No,
Samuel did.
Well, Elisha didn't hear either, did he? He said, feed them, don't kill them.
In either case, did the king slay anybody that he had taken captive?
Yes.
They treated them like prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention.
Yes, but what do you think? The point that's raised is, have standards changed now? Why the difference?
It is mentioned in there that they were to kill all inhabitants of their promised land. But I read the section where it says, well, when you make war with people outside, and it outlines a different way of handling that.
Of course, was it the policy after they went into Canaan that whenever they fought, they were to slaughter everybody, men, women, and children, and this was the method forever and ever from then on? Or was it that when they first went in, now of course they didn't go in as God intended. He said, I will go ahead of you, and I will clear the land for you. Now leave it up to me to decide which of my sinful children in that land I should put to sleep. There's no way you can live with them, and history proved that they were not able to live with them. Even Solomon was seduced by the worship of these people. So God knew what he was saying when he said, you cannot live with them. Now, let me make the decision, and let me do it. I'll send the angel, I'll send the forces of nature ahead, I'll use the hornet, you remember, and I will eliminate those people. That would have been the best way. But no, they preferred to fight. Well, he said, then if you're going to do it, you must go in there, and you must eliminate those people, and you must eliminate them entirely. That was a terrible thing to do. God never intended that they have to do it themselves. But they didn't do it. In fact, they settled down to live with them, and they intermarried with them, as Solomon did, you remember. And Nehemiah says, foreign women even made that great wise king to sin. They never were able to live with them. But God wasn't saying, now from now on, every time you go to battle, you must slaughter everybody. The time came when they had to live with these people. They weren't going down to Egypt to kill everybody there or going up to Babylon to kill everybody there. This was an emergency situation at the time, and it got all confused. It was of our own making that it was so confused. It was still confused when they came back from Babylonian captivity, remember? And here were these people still there, and they intermarried with them all over again. When we read Ezra and Nehemiah, that's where it's most dramatically stated. And Nehemiah had to take a very forceful stand, and he asked those Jewish refugees to send those foreign women and the children away. Oh, that was painful to do. We have that coming up in Nehemiah. Well, they never were supposed to be in that situation. You ask, how could God work through Nehemiah to do this? Well, this was a very extreme emergency. What is God going to do when faced with such critically difficult situations of our own making? Of course, the easy way would be to say, I think I'll take that little planet and send it off way into some corner of the universe and isolate it and quarantine it and leave them there to work this thing out on their own. And I suspect in due course, when we go to visit it, there won't be anybody alive. They'll all be gone. Well, they were down to 8 once, weren't they? That would be one good way to take care of it, wouldn't it? And God said, no, maybe you angels wouldn't miss that one tiny planet, but I would. Besides, I'm just not that kind of a God. And look how he's risked his reputation to work with the inhabitants on this planet. So he picks a good friend, Abraham, and says, I'll work through your children. And look how they behaved. Not that they were any worse or better than anybody else. He doesn't work with us, because we're that much better than anybody else. He works with everybody. He gives some marvelous opportunities. And when they turn it down, that is very serious. That's more where we are, I think. We have an opportunity. If we waste it, that much more reprehensible is it of us to have done so and to have let him down. Well, there's much more of this coming up in these stories that follow. The she-bear story is ahead of this, though, isn't it? Back in chapter 2, here's this marvelous experience of Elijah being translated to heaven in the chariots of fire. And I always loved that as a boy, and how Elisha came back, and took the cloak and smote the water. It's all one of the best stories to tell, isn't it? Well, some people weren't impressed. And you notice in chapter 2, verse 23, that among the people who were not impressed were some boys. 2:23, Elisha went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys, my version says, came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head. Why don't you go up too, Baldy?" Think of being able to say that after this extraordinary event of a human being being translated to heaven without seeing death. And he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. From there he went on to Mount Carmel, and thence he returned to Samaria. And the word went through the land that you better take this prophet rather seriously. Now, what do you have for boys? Were they little boys, adolescent boys? Your version says youths. The New King James has youths, all right? Does yours have the same? The Berkeley has youths. What do the rest of you have? Small boys. And I have the Revised Standard, small boys. It isn't going to soften it much either way, is it?
The Hebrew is children.
Children.
Yeah.
These were young boys. Now, why would God deal so severely with them? Or Elisha, anyway? And God, it says, it would seem was involved in the she-bears coming, wouldn't you think? Why would gentle Jesus send she-bears? Have you ever wished, just once in a while, that a couple of she-bears would at least peek in the window? You're working your head off to teach, say, a Sabbath school of children, and you just can't hold their attention. There's something else that's distracting them, and you've tried everything else, and you don't want the she-bears to tear them, but, if they just peek in the Sabbath school room and growl a little bit, wouldn't you be grateful for that? How are we to understand his God at work through a very special person, Elisha? And here we have she-bears coming. Would Jesus send she-bears? Would that have to be the Father who sent the she-bears? Well, we know better than that, don't we? Jesus said, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." And Paul says he's the one who led Israel in those days anyway. It makes no difference, Father, Son, or Holy Spirit. So how would one explain this to children? God hasn't used that method lately. Miss Morse is dealing right now. The committee, by the way, working on the continual revision of the Bible books for the children, is in session at Loma Linda right now. Miss Elsa Nelson is there, who's had such a wonderful influence over this program. And you came right from the meetings all day. So I doubt you were on the she-bears today, but how did you deal with that?
I think we need to remember that, again, it's sort of like touching the ark.
Yeah.
That it was a matter of reverence for God and a matter of reverence for God's servants. And I think when we were studying it one time, we read that had these young men, or these youths, or I think they were older than most of us think they were, had these young men been allowed to continue in this kind of activity, that it would have demoralized Elisha's work. People would not have listened to Elisha because Elijah was their prophet. And Elisha was now taking over his work. They would not have listened to Elisha. It would have done irreparable damage to the work that Elisha had to do, plus it would have caused a great sense of irreverence among the people. And so possibly for the greater good. This had to be dealt with immediately. Maybe it was another case where God needed to get their attention.
Now, what do you think of the method that Ms. Morse took there? She immediately compared it with other illustrations in the Bible. I think that's always the way to go. You think of Uzzah, you mentioned first, and Ananias and Sapphira later on, and Nadab and Abihu in the tabernacle even being so irreverent, and many other examples like it. And of course, the whole story of Sinai. What alternative does God have? Well, first we have to realize how serious the situation was and how little reverence there was for God. As I mentioned in the beginning, the king of Israel, their leader, is consulting Beelzebub. That's how serious things were. And do you notice through Kings, particularly here in Chronicles, that when there's a good leader, things pick up in the kingdom. When there's a bad leader, things decline. They were very much influenced by their leader, their king. And if the king of Israel is consulting Beelzebub, imagine the influence on the people. More than that, Israel had been privileged to either see or to hear anyway of this extraordinary event. Elijah translated to heaven. You'd have thought that would have inspired some reverence. It didn't. All it did was to lead these youths to scoff and mock. And evidently, Elisha was short of hair there. And they said, "Hey, Baldy, why don't you go up too?" Can you imagine? Well, I think they were only behaving in a way that was representative of the lack of reverence among all the people. And where there is no reverence, there's very little God can do. In fact, reverence for God is the beginning of wisdom, isn't it? The beginning of learning. And so God runs the risk here of getting attention, of inspiring respect, as he has on so many other occasions. Eventually, he comes to the place where even the thunders of Sinai will not inspire reverence and respect. Then he lets them go into captivity. That's the next. There is no remedy, not even dramatic attempts to get their attention will work. Then what else can he do but let them go? So wouldn't we agree that God ran a serious risk here in sending the she-bears? Now, the risk is of being misunderstood. Are we misunderstanding him tonight? Or do we rather say, "Thank you for doing that. I mean, you gave the enemy an opportunity to accuse you still more before the heavenly family and say, look at that God sending she-bears. He can't get respect unless he terrifies people." Well, unfortunately, that was true. How important was it to get their respectful attention? If they didn't listen, eventually all he could do is let them go. So rather than let them go, he seems to play into the adversary's hands. Now, are we grateful that he did that? Had he not done it, where would we be now? Yes?
It's interesting, too, because Ellen White, in speaking of respect for the ministry, admonishes us, if we go home on Sabbath, not to serve a preacher for lunch, not to have the preacher.
Oh, not to serve the preacher himself for lunch. Oh, I like that.
So the admonition has always been there for God's people, regardless of where they be. There's always that tendency for disrespect, for questioning. Our admonitions in Volume 3 of Testimonies are very strong in that area also.
Even if the sermon may not have been that good.
Especially if that's
You remind me of a cartoon I saw once of a missionary who was caught by cannibals and put in the pot. A book fell from the hand of the missionary, and the cannibal chief was reading it as he waited for his dinner, now being prepared in the pot. And the title of the book was How to Serve Humanity. And that's the other kind of serving there. Now, speaking of reverence, is this story to be connected with it? In 2 Kings chapter 13, after Elisha dies. In 2 Kings 13, verse 20, "So Elisha died, and they buried him. Now bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. And as a man was being buried, lo, a marauding band was seen, and the man was cast into the grave of Elisha. And as soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet." And you can just imagine that, if we can't, the children can. I mean, here they are taking this man out in a funeral procession to bury him. And before they get to the burial site, a band of Moabites comes into view. And so in terror, they toss the man into this cave and run for their lives. Happens to be the cave where Elisha's bones are resting. And as soon as the deceased touches the bones of Elisha, he comes to life, climbs out and looks, and here are the Moabites, and there goes the funeral procession. So he takes off after the procession. Then they look over their shoulders, and they see not only the Moabites, but the deceased. I should think they'd run twice as fast. I mean, it's a very dramatic story, it seems to me. Isn't that a tale to have in the Bible? What do you do with that? Now, one thing one could do is to say, that's just I'd have to put that in a class with the angel stirring the water of the pool of Bethesda. which, by the way, is one of the very few places in the Bible where there is a very strange and difficult story, not supported by the early manuscripts at all. Ellen White never endorsed that story. That's a legend that an angel stirred the water and God healed the first man in. They thought it was so, but it wasn't. Do you think God would do that? Well, that might lead someone to think this is the same, but no, it's in the Hebrew, it's there. Can you fit this story in? Why would God do such a thing? In a day when axe heads floated and all kinds of other miracles. Would it increase respect?
Reference to Elijah, the young kids.
Yes.
I was thinking to myself, just like last week we were talking about what would have happened if the prophet, instead of just not slapping the other prophet's face,
yes,
he had said, well, let me check with my God, with God myself too, and find out what he would communicate to me about this.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help but wonder what would have happened if Elisha had not cursed the youth. What would have they done? Would they have gotten bolder? And there's the verse in the New Testament says that a prophet has honor except in his own country. I've seen that on one occasion God was jealous for the honor of Moses. Moses didn't know that his sister and Aaron were bickering behind his back, but God said, how was it that you were not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?
Yeah. Well, now, following what you've said, earlier on we read at the end of 2 Chronicles how they mocked his prophets, and here they're mocking Elisha. It's the very thing. It's an illustration of that. But they hadn't reached the place yet where God could no longer work with them. Well, the way he works with them is to send the she-bears. And I'm sure that report went all through the communities. You'd better take this new prophet seriously. And yet, what kind of a man was he? He's the man who says to the king, don't slay them, feed them. You see, I mean, God's still working with them. But there comes a day when there's nothing more he can do. There is no remedy, and he pours out his wrath, it says. And we're accumulating the evidence as to what God's wrath is. Hosea will speak to that most eloquently, and then Romans will really nail it down. It's not human anger by any means at all. It's God saying, there's nothing more I can do for you. And then he gives us up and lets us go, and we reap the consequences, as Israel did. God loved his people at the time, and he cries over them as they go into captivity, how can I let you go? How can I give you up? But you're bent on leaving me. So I'm going to let you go. But I'm going to love you all the way there, and I'm going to help you while you're there. And a death decree was passed, was it not? To kill them in Babylonian captivity. And where's a book that describes how God loved his people and protected them? That's the book of Esther, though it never mentions the name of God. So God still hasn't really given them up. See, he's never really ever given anybody up except his son. And he died. And we were supposed to get the message that we don't have to go through the same experience. But that's all coming down the line, isn't it?
With regard to the dead man coming back to life.
Oh, yes.
It's nothing specific, and I know we should stick to specifics, but
yes.
I don't believe God does anything or allows anything to happen that doesn't have 2 or more good consequences. And
yes.
There must have been a lesson in there for somebody at the time, or I'm sure he wouldn't have allowed that to happen.
Well, this is a very useful point that's raised. Do you remember when Jesus made the wine in Cana? And it says, this beginning of, well, there are different words for wonders, miracles, and signs. The word that's used in John is signs. This beginning of signs. And the word for sign is semeion, from which we get semantics. A sign is something that has meaning. And he performed that miracle at Cana, not just to show his power, but to say several things at the time. The fact that he graced that wedding with his presence was eloquent. The first miracle that he wrought was at a wedding reception. Well, he's the one who thought up the idea of weddings, didn't he, back in the Garden of Eden. So the first thing he did was to represent his endorsement of this thing that he thought up in the beginning. So I like your thought that when we read of a miracle, it's for a purpose. He doesn't do these things loosely. They're to say something. They're to mean something.
Well, I imagine after this happened, everybody remembered Elisha and his messages about God.
Oh, that's
and
the whole
it would
idea.
be another reminder of all
Yeah.
the things Elisha, because everybody would be talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And they would say, remember when this happened, and
Yeah.
remember this, and remember this. So I think it would be a good review.
What do you think about that? Now, it's too bad God has to go to those lengths. You know, if you haven't been treating Pastor Stutler with proper respect, it would be too bad if after his... I don't want this to happen, but, I mean, say someday way down the line, we have a funeral for the pastor, and somebody goes out to his grave, and amazing miracles happen, and for the first time, the church in West Covina remembers Elder Stutler with respect. That's sad. I mean, it just speaks of the emergency those days. What a shame they didn't treat Elisha with respect. But God will go to great lengths to win respect, even if he has to do a miracle like this. So I don't think it's just a funny story by any means. It is rather dramatic. I venture that was reported. Imagine when the funeral procession got home, panting from the run. He said, you should have seen what happened as they made their reports. Well, they said, we have some messages left over from Elisha. We better go on taking them seriously. His ministry started with 2 she-bears and wound up with this miracle at the funeral, you know, and lots of things in between. It's too bad that miracles are necessary to win respect. Jesus realized that miracles were winning respect, the free food and the free healing. And he didn't want to be followed for those reasons, and so he began teaching them the message, and they all left him. And you remember in the end, they said, do us a miracle, and then we'll know whether you're the Messiah or not. No, he said, I'm not going to resort to that. And you remember in Desire of Ages, Ellen White says that Christ knew that they were looking for a Messiah who'd come with all kinds of miracle-working power. And so when he had so few converts in the end, he was tempted to demonstrate his power and win 1 million souls in one day, you know. No, he wouldn't do it.
Look at the miracle he performed when they came to take him after they came out of the garden.
Yes.
And John cuts off the servant's ear and he heals him. Yes. And then they come to take him and he says, here I am. And his divinity flashes through and he wipes, they all fall down. Yeah. And then they stand up and he says, here I am, come and get me. 2 miracles, one of healing and one of God's divinity flashing through, and nothing. I mean, nothing.
Didn't win anybody.
Didn't win a soul. Not even John. Until later, but they didn't see it.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it said an angel stepped between there? I just think Jesus healed that man Malchus's ear because that's the way he is. He just spontaneously did it, whatever the influence might be on others. And as you said, we weren't there to see it. But the record of it has won a lot of people in years since then, hasn't it, as far as that's concerned? And I'm sure it won a lot of angels. Well, not that they needed to be won, but their faith needed to be confirmed. And they loved to see how Jesus behaved there in the garden and that he would heal Malchus. And I'm sure Peter got the message after a while that this is not the way to set up the kingdom.
Just like Noah, when he found out what one of his sons had done to him while he was drunk. Can some curses, and in some cases they're quite elaborate, can they be inspired by the Holy Spirit?
Oh, say a little more about that.
I was wondering, can a curse on certain occasions be inspired, prompted by the Holy Spirit? I'd like to think that Elijah was just as patient and long-suffering a person as Elijah was.
Now, we haven't talked a lot about curses and how they work, have we? Who was the first to do some cursing in the Bible? God himself. Yeah, isn't that significant? Cursed be the ground for your sake. And one could trace that through the Bible. That's a very interesting subject. Wonder what would be the best time to do that as we go through. You remember later on Jesus cursed a tree and it withered up the next time they came by? Maybe that would be the best time to discuss this, because here's the Son of God in person setting an example. And you remember he cursed that fig tree? But maybe we should wait till that day, and we'd have all these occasions to bring together on that occasion with Jesus doing it himself. It doesn't bear much resemblance to human cursing, that's for sure, does it? Why do you think there's so much miracle in here, by the way? There's so many miracles. Is it that the more faith, the more miracles? Or is it the other way around almost? Not that there aren't miracles when there's much faith, but there's different miracles. But miracles that are to win respect and to attract attention and to make for confidence that our God can do these things.
The greatest miracle is a consistent Christian life in the presence of a fallen world.
Yes. Do you think if we had more faith nowadays, we could close all our hospitals and we could just rely on miracles for everything? No need to work anymore because every time you go to the pantry, there's always food there, the oil never runs out, and the meal is always there. Is that likely to be the case?
God never does for us what we can do for ourselves as long as we're doing it according to His will. As we're following His way, He isn't going to come down and work any miracles.
What do you think of a God, though, who, when there is so little faith in Him, will actually perform more miracles, remarkable miracles? He always looks good in this, you see.
The opposite of extreme of the thunder and lightning to get their attention. He'll go either way, whichever way is more likely to win their attention.
Agreed? Now, let's go to another thing in here. In 2 Kings 16 is a story of one of the sieges of Jerusalem. And we see God very much at work in this chapter, and it's commented on most significantly by the prophet Isaiah. Let's start with verse 1 to get the whole scene. In the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God, as his father David had done. Have you noticed how David is always described as so virtuous, always doing the right thing? God is, as we said before, incredibly generous. If God were not like this, it wouldn't be safe to live with him in the hereafter. Can you imagine God introducing David to somebody in the hereafter? Here's a man after my own heart who always did what pleased me. And remember we read last week in 1 Kings how God described this man who did many regrettable things. And yet he never gave up his belief in God. Is there evidence that David went after Baal and Ashtaroth and Moloch and so on? He never did that. Solomon did. But David didn't. And that's the real difference, even though he sinned. It says, Ahaz walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He even burned his son as an offering. That would be the worship of Moloch, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, to the north, came up to wage war on Jerusalem. And they besieged Ahaz, but could not conquer him. Now, was the siege eventually lifted? The real details are yet to be found over here in Isaiah 7. See, one has to realize that these prophetical books, they belong back in the days of Kings and Chronicles. Look over in Isaiah 7. In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but they could not conquer it. Sound familiar? Well, we're reading in Isaiah. When the house of David was told, Syria is in league with Ephraim is the tribes to the north, his heart and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. And the Lord said to the prophet Isaiah, Go forth to meet Ahaz. And we've had the description in Kings of how he was grossly misbehaving. Go and meet him, you and your son Shear-Jashub, later described by Isaiah as a son who'd been given to convey a message, a son who was a sign. Go and meet him at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field, and say to him, Take heed, be quiet, do not fear. And do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands. That's a good way to describe somebody, isn't it? at the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah. Because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tabiel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, and it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus. These names sound familiar from the news these days. And the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be broken to pieces so that it will no longer be a people. And so it was. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. That's a good text for a sermon, isn't it? Again the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol. What do you have for Sheol in your version each time? Netherworld. Yeah, that's one of the meanings, really. It's the grave, the place of the dead. Sometimes even hell, it may appear. Or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Then he said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. A sign of what? Well, that kings Rezin and Pekah would be driven off. Isn't that what he needed? And here's the sign. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a King James virgin, other versions young woman, shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose 2 kings you are in dread will be deserted. In other words, it was a sign, wasn't it? The kings Rezin and Pekah would be driven off. Now, what would it mean to King Ahaz for Isaiah to say, hundreds of years from now, a little baby will be born in Bethlehem. And that will be a sign to you, King Ahaz, that the siege will be lifted. For before that little boy, not to be born for hundreds and hundreds of years, is old enough to say, my father or my mother, these 2 kings will be driven off. In that case, Ahaz, Pekah, and Rezin would have to live to be 700, 800 years old. And it wasn't so, was it? Then what baby was this? I mean, just reading it along, not knowing what Matthew does with it later on, we'd say that baby must have been born back then, wouldn't you? Just reading it? Well, was the baby born? Remember now, Isaiah already has a child, a son, who has a name that has a meaning that is a sign to Israel. That's in your footnote, isn't it? Let's look at chapter 8. Then the Lord said to me, take a large tablet and write upon it in common characters belonging to the longest name in the Bible, Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. And I won many a Bible guessing game with that because I was lucky enough to find it when I was a small boy, and nobody else knew M stood for Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. If Mephibosheth wouldn't do it, Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz would always win it for me. And I got reliable witnesses, says the prophet Isaiah, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jerebekiah to attest for me. And I, the prophet, went to the prophetess. And as a result, she conceived and bore a son. And I'm rather inclined to think that had to be Mrs. Isaiah, wouldn't you? And the Lord said to me, call your son's name Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. For before the child knows how to cry, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Syria. And that's exactly what happened. Then what's the baby? Who's the baby in Isaiah 7:14? I mean, it had to be that baby, Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. Well, then how could Matthew say, and we're at the season of the year when we think about this, aren't we? A baby being born in Bethlehem. Matthew says that when Jesus was born of a virgin, as indeed she was, conceived of the Holy Spirit, this was to fulfill. Now that's a word that calls for much interpretation. What does it mean to fulfill? It was to fulfill the prophecy in Isaiah 7:14. Yes, to make it more complete, to add to it. But you see, Matthew had a lot of help in Isaiah to do this very thing. Because read on a little further. Chapter 8, verse... Well, let's go first into 9, then come back to 8. In chapter 9, verse 6... And the prophet Isaiah is writing, "To us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, or Shear-Jashub." Not this time. This time, Wonderful Counselor. Isn't that the name we usually give the Holy Spirit? Comforter, Counselor. Mighty God, who comes to mind first? How about Everlasting Father, who comes to mind first? Then Prince of Peace. All three names of the members of the Godhead are attributed to the Son. And that really says something about the Godhead. Jesus is the Everlasting Father, the Almighty God, the Wonderful Counselor, the Prince of Peace. That's why Ellen White could say if the Father had come instead of the Son, history would have been not one whit different. They're all equally loving, equally powerful, equally gracious, though three persons to be sure. So this is a marvelous way to approach the Trinity, it seems to me. Well, now, this isn't Isaiah's boy, is it? This is the Son of God, and we sing about it in the Messiah. Are some of you in an oratorio that will sing the Messiah this Christmas season? And so Matthew was helped to see that just as a baby was born, in fulfillment of God's prediction through the prophet Isaiah, just as a baby was born to say to Ahaz, bad as he was, God is still with you. Immanuel means God's among us. God is with us. God was with his people, wasn't he? Just as there was a baby born to encourage them, so there will be an infinitely more important baby born to say that God is with us all, bad as we've all behaved. The parallel is there, but it grows from a lesser baby to a much more important baby. Later on, when we're in Isaiah and Ezekiel, we'll notice how many times the Bible does this. It goes from a lesser person to a more important person, from the king of Tyre to Lucifer, from the king of Babylon to Lucifer. This is something the Bible writers did. So we have parallels here to confirm our interpreting this way. But now in Isaiah 7:14, then, should it be virgin or young woman? Mrs. Isaiah had already had one boy. And that's why the Hebrew word is really young woman of marriageable age. Maybe a virgin, maybe not. It isn't making the point. There is another word for virgin, and it's not used. Now with Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Greek word is absolutely a virgin because she was, but not here. And that's why your version may say young woman. If anything, it is more technically correct. But have we lost the meaning? I think the meaning's that much better. It's even bigger. Now, in the middle of all this is that important key text, Isaiah 8:20. It's in the middle of all of this. And it accumulates much more significance, I think, from being seen in this light. Now look at 8:16. And think of how Israel was not listening to God. Think how Saul consulted the dead in behalf of the living. Think of Josiah taking all the mediums and the wizards out when he came to the throne. That's what Israel was doing. They were not consulting God. So in 8:18, Isaiah says, bind up the testimony. The testimony is what prophets speak. And seal the teaching. That's the Torah. That's the law. That's the writings of Moses, for example, among my disciples. In other words, God's word to us, the Bible, as much as there was those days. I, said Isaiah, I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and you know why he appears to be doing so. And I will go on hoping in him. Behold, says Isaiah, I and the children, plural, whom the Lord has given me, are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwells on Mount Zion. And we know the names of at least two of them, Shear-Jashub and Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, who were given to show that God was still with them and working with them. Now look how he goes on. When they say to you, consult the mediums and the wizards who chirp and mutter. Do you have peep and mutter? I always like that in the King James. Peep and mutter. What do you have in yours? Whisper and mutter. Should not a people consult their God? Should they consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the teaching and to the testimony. Surely for this word which they speak, that's the peepers and the mutterers, the wizards and the witches. Surely this message which they speak, there is no dawn, there is no light, there is no truth in what they're saying. So that key text is even better. In other words, consult God and all that He's ever said to us before. And consult Him even now at the present time. Don't consult others, certainly not the dead in behalf of the living, as Saul. And so here's Isaiah, when the king of Israel and the people of Israel are behaving so badly and things are getting worse and worse, telling them, look, God is still with you. Look at my two sons. He's trying to get your attention and invite you to listen to Him rather than these others. So I think Isaiah 7, 8, and 9 are even better than they were just taken out of context. Eventually, when the world was so wicked that Ellen White says the very stamp of demons was on the faces of men, and even His own loyal people were pretentiously pious, obeying God for the wrong reason, God sent His own Son to live among them. And truly He was the ultimate Immanuel, that God was with us. And then when they turned Him down, He said, I'll have to turn from you to the rest of the world. Maybe they will listen. Of course, was He abandoning all His people? Who were the first missionaries to go out to the rest of the world? But Jews, weren't they? And Jesus was a Jew. So we have to put that in its full historical setting all the way along. And even then, God didn't win that many. Well, 3,000 at Pentecost, it's not that many. He's never won very many. Well, unless you include the universe. The angels have been watching this long history, and are they impressed? Read the book of Revelation to see how they feel about all this evidence. You're righteous and holy and just and good, and they never tire of telling Him so. Too bad that we who live in the middle of it, among whom God has been so generous and so gracious, should not agree with the angels. That would be ingratitude, or worse, misunderstanding. Well, let's go back to Kings. When we come to Isaiah, we'll have to look at that again. Do you have a question about that, by the way? There's nothing lost. I mean, it's a pure gain, I think, to look at the verses that way. So when you have a version that says, not virgin, but young woman, there's no malicious corruption of the text there. No, that's the way it reads. But this isn't denying the virgin birth of Christ at all, or the prediction. It's right there if you take 7, 8, and 9 together. There's nothing lost. It's a gain. Because if you take this as only referring to the birth of Christ, what are you going to do with the baby that was born for poor King Ahaz? You can't make sense out of it. So if you take this larger view of it, it all makes sense then. There were two babies, a human baby assigned to King Ahaz, though he didn't deserve it. And then the divine human baby, later born of a virgin to be sure, and we still didn't deserve it, and yet God was with us. So there's no loss in there.
One would naturally say that it was talking, at least on one level, of a child born at that time. The reading young woman, or Alma, is based in the Masoretic's text, which comes to us from after the time of Christ. That is a Hebrew text. Matthew, when he wrote that, probably wasn't quoting from the Hebrew Masoretic text, but rather from an earlier translation into the Greek, which did use the word virgin. So whether the original said Alma after the Masoretic text, or whether the translation to virgin by the Greek translation was from actually an earlier textual strain is an interesting question.
Yes, very. Now, not to get too technical, there's a technical reply one could give to that, and then there's maybe a common sense one. On the technical one, there are two words in the Hebrew. Bethulah is a virgin. Alma means a young woman, virgin or not, of marriageable age. And the Hebrew Masoretic text says, not Bethulah virgin, but Alma, a young woman. Now there was a translation into the Greek, as you mentioned, called the Septuagint. We've discussed that before. Paul often used it, often quotes from it. In very interesting places. When we get to Hebrews, we'll see some very interesting quotations from the Septuagint. Now, it's very rarely that we would suggest that the Hebrew is less reliable than the Greek translation. Because the hazard in translation is that you interpret as you translate. More than that, we now have a much older manuscript of Isaiah, I believe. Much, much older. I think that the real decision has to be made not so much on a technical basis as on the context, right there. Supposing the Hebrew is virgin, then we've got 2 virgin births in the Bible. And we have a most interesting predicament. Because this baby was unquestionably born right there and then. Or God was saying something very meaningless to Ahaz. Ahaz, a virgin, hundreds of years from now, is going to have a baby boy. Be of good cheer, that means the siege will be lifted. It wouldn't have meant anything to him, would it? So I would vote for the Masoretic text. By the way, would you remember this conversation? Not the technical details necessarily, but this question will arise again and again. Matthew's use of the Old Testament. We can't avoid it. For example, when we're reading in Hosea, we'll come to the magnificent chapter where God says, "You're bent on leaving me, I'll have to let you go." That chapter begins with God saying, "When Israel was young, I loved her, and out of Egypt I called him," never mind the gender, "to be my son." And Matthew says that when Jesus went down to Egypt in the days of King Herod and then came back, this was to fulfill the prediction of Hosea, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." But if you read Hosea 11, it says, "Out of Egypt I called him to be my son, but the more I called him, the further they went from me, and they made sacrifices to the Baals." Did Jesus do that? So I'm afraid Hosea 11 is talking about the Exodus. And it's not talking about Jesus coming out of Egypt. So then you say, well, you mean an inspired writer in the New Testament would misquote the Old? No, we have to work out some understanding of how Matthew used the Old. Let's find out how he did it. He did it many times. So he must have had a way of doing it, and I believe there's a way to explain it. Much of it has to do with the word fulfill that you talked about a while ago. I don't see any contradiction here, but this question of Isaiah 7:14 and the virgin birth prediction must be matched with many others. So maybe it won't be till we get to Matthew that we'll discuss it. Maybe in Hosea we'll do it. And there'll be others. Yes?
Very unusual.
No.
Right in the midst of a seemingly useless paragraph, as far as we're concerned, a star shines right out of it that refers to the Christ that is to come. And it's buried right in among stuff that you wouldn't even think.
That's right. So we would do well to note all the places like this at one time if we can. So, well, thanks, Pastor Fox. You complimented us for bringing up something that technical. But sometimes one has to look at those things. What I like is that one may have to be a little technical for a little while, but out of it can come clarity and simplicity, or else I'm a little suspicious of it. So I'm glad you referred to it.
We also have to understand there was no Masoretic text at that time either.
No, strictly speaking, not till the 7th century AD. That's true.
Also that we need to understand the historical context.
Oh, yes.
You know, because certainly this young woman who was born, Ha'alma, the young woman, is very definite.
Yes.
And if this was a young woman who was not a virgin, and she would be dead. I mean, the commandments called for stoning, so that she wouldn't exist in this sense. Mm-hmm. So whether it's young woman or virgin, Bethula, at this point it really makes no difference in the context, because this young woman gives birth to the Son, and the application is made later, and the prophecy having the dual effect.
Yes. Surely does look like Mrs. Isaiah, doesn't it? Who has these 2 sons, and she's already had 1 boy. Well, there's nothing lost, you notice, without knowing these technical matters. If one just read it through in English translation, we come out all right, don't we? And I rather like that. Ellen White makes the comment, the Bible was not written for the scholar alone. On the contrary, the common person, if led by the Spirit, can sometimes best understand the Scriptures. Now, that's not only making light of technical knowledge. I find that technical knowledge will only support this. If we have to go look at it, let's do. You'll find a consistency there. This is what I loved about the fact I chose to study in the field that I did. I had to learn the languages and the textual criticism and all the rest of it. And the more I looked, the more the evidence accumulated, and it was confirming rather than dismaying. Wouldn't you agree? So, but let's note this as we go along, how future writers in the Bible will refer to these passages we're reading now. Well, this is the classic here. Because this particular version, the Revised Standard, chose to translate young woman instead of virgin, it was publicly burned. I have a picture of it being burned outside a church, appropriately on Furnace Street, Akron, Ohio. Well, we'll have another chance when we get to Isaiah. Let's look at this again. As our time comes to an end, though, notice in 2 Kings, a little further over, in chapter 19, it's a whole description of the people and how they were behaving in those days. And in contrast, we see God still working with them. And the contrast makes it all the more vivid. First of all, let's do the siege of Jerusalem, then come to that. In chapter 19, verse 35, you remember this long siege? And then they went out in the morning, and 185,000 Assyrians were dead. And it says in 35, it was the angel of the Lord who went forth and slew them, these Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and dwelt at Nineveh. And you remember his end. Is this another case of what God would have done had they let him do it? The angel took care of the Assyrians. There's no way the Jews could have done it themselves. This was a huge army, led by a great king and general. But here's a case where God says, look, if you'd only let me do it, I'd do it for you all the time. I think we have a number of instances like this, where when Israel was sufficiently desperate, they let God look after them. And he showed he could have done it all the time. They would not have had to fight. Well, what do you think? Yes.
In World War I, a large group of Allied soldiers came up from the malarial marshes around the Mediterranean Sea, were marched up in a day into Jerusalem, and they died the next day like the Syrians from a form of malaria. Mm-hmm. Of course, that can be interpreted by people as being a great striking down and so forth, but it happened in history, a disease vector.
Would you think it was similar here and is just described as the angel of the Lord doing it? It wouldn't matter.
Found their men dead the next day.
It wouldn't make any difference, would it? But at least Israel did not fight them. They were incapable of doing it, and so God took care of them. I like to see these evidences from time to time of how God could have done it. Now go back to 17. This is the time when God let the 10 northern tribes go. He could no longer work with them. And look at the description of them here. In 17, let's say begin with verse 7. Right up above, in the paragraph above that, it says, the king of Syria invaded all the land. See verse 5? And came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. And in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, captured Samaria. And he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. He scattered them. And this was so because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations, whom the Lord drove out from before the people of Israel, and in the customs which the kings of Israel had introduced. This is what the people of Israel had done. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places at all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they burned incense on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. And they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, Ye shall not do this. Yet the Lord warned Israel to the north and Judah to the south by every prophet and every seer, saying, Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, in accordance with all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servants the prophets. But they would not listen. It's interesting, the word obedience in the Bible means a willingness to listen, to hearken. They would not listen, but they were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and the warnings which he gave them, like the warning about a king. They didn't take it seriously. They went after false gods, false idols, and became false. Now that's one of the verses that is the basis for Ellen White's statement, it is a law that we become like the person we worship and admire. It's not a punishment, it's not arbitrary, it's the way it works. If you go after something false, you become false. And there'll be many other verses that will say that as we go through. You know, the most sublime thoughts you'll find in Ellen White were already here in Scripture. And she came along not to add, but to point back to this and see that it's there. They went after false idols, and they became false. And they followed the nations that were round about them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. And they forsook all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made for themselves molten images of 2 calves. And they made an Asherah, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. And Jeremiah is going to say they made raisin cakes for the queen of heaven even during the siege. That's how bad it was. And they burned their sons and their daughters as offerings. These are God's chosen people doing this. And they used divination and sorcery, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger, though we need to understand his anger, and it is explained and demonstrated at great length. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel. Actually, he loved them. And he removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. That's the 2 tribes really to the south. Judah. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God. See, they had a little longer, didn't they? Several decades they were left. Babylon had not come to invade yet the south. Assyria had taken the ones to the north. But the people to the south walked in the customs which Israel to the north had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them, and gave them into the hand of spoilers, until he had cast them out of his sight. But remember how he worked with them? Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Esther, and look at all the people he worked with. And when he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drove Israel to the north from following the Lord, and made them commit great sin. The people of Israel to the north walked in all the sins which Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had spoken by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. And it goes on to explain how the king of Assyria brought in these other peoples from Babylon. And see all these places? Brought them in, placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and dwelt in its cities. And at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them. These are the imported people, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told that the nations which you've carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they're killing them, because they do not know the law of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, Send there one of the priests whom you carried away thence, and let him go and dwell there and teach them the law of the God of the land. Isn't that extraordinary? So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel, and taught them how they should fear the Lord. But every nation still made gods of its own, and put them in the shrines of the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities in which they dwelt. The men of Babylon made, and here's a list now of all the things they made. See them following down, and how they burned their children in the fire. This is happening now in northern Israel. These are the imported people doing it. They all feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. So they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods. What a muddle up north now, after the manner of the nations among whom they had been carried away. To this day they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord, and they do not follow the statutes or the ordinances or the law or the commandment which the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. The Lord made a covenant with them and commanded them, "You shall not fear other gods, or bow yourselves to them, or serve them, or sacrifice to them. But you shall fear the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, with great power and with an outstretched arm. You shall bow yourselves to him, and to him you shall sacrifice. And the statutes and the ordinances and the law and the commandment which he wrote for you, you shall always be careful to do. You shall not fear other gods, and you shall not forget the covenant that I have made with you. You shall not fear other gods, but you shall fear the Lord your God. And he will deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies." However, they would not listen, but they did according to their former manner. So these nations feared the Lord and also served their graven images. Their children likewise, and their children's children, as their fathers did, so they do to this day. Now, what would God do in that mess up north? Meanwhile, he's working with the ones left to the south and sending marvelous messages to them. Jeremiah is one of the clearest pictures in the whole Bible. Marvelous explanations, just as clear as any other writer in the Bible. I like Jeremiah just as much as Isaiah. He's a gospel prophet too. Well, meanwhile, in the south, there's King Hezekiah. And in 2 Kings 20, it tells the story of this king. And you remember he got sick? And he was very disturbed that maybe he was going to die. And the prophet came and gave him some encouraging words. And in chapter 20, verse 8, Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "What shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me, and that I shall go up to the house of the Lord on the third day?" And Isaiah said, "This is the sign to you from the Lord, that the Lord will do the thing that he has promised. Shall the shadow go forward 10 steps, or go back 10 steps? And Hezekiah answered, "It is an easy thing for the shadow to lengthen 10 steps. Doesn't seem to be going down fast these days. Rather let the shadow go back 10 steps. And Isaiah the prophet cried to the Lord, and he brought the shadow back 10 steps, by which the sun had declined on the dial of Ahaz. At that time, Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, I didn't pronounce that first one right, Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and a present to Hezekiah. For he heard that Hezekiah had been sick." That's very solicitous, isn't it? "And Hezekiah welcomed them, and he showed them all his treasure house." Now, there's a little background for this. See, Chronicles has more details, and that's why it's good to read Chronicles afterwards. It says in Chronicles that the Babylonians, they were great astronomers, you know. And they noticed this amazing thing that had happened, and they heard about it. And they sent people to Hezekiah to learn of this marvelous thing. What an opportunity for Hezekiah to tell them about God. So what did he do? He took them through the treasury. He showed them the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oil, his armory, and all that was found in his storehouses. There was nothing in his house or in all his realm that Hezekiah did not show them. And I'm sure he said from time to time, "We have all this because the Lord has been good to us." And the Babylonians didn't care about that. They just noted there was a lot of stuff worth coming to pick up a little later, which they came to do. So then Isaiah the prophet came to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say? And whence did they come to you?" And Hezekiah said, "They've come from a far country, from Babylon." And Isaiah said, "Well, what have they seen in your house?" And Hezekiah answered, "They've seen all that is in my house. There's nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them." And Isaiah said, "They'll be coming to get it all." Now, Chronicles is so remarkable on this, and it's an invitation then to take a good look at Chronicles for next time. It's there explained that this happened to test Hezekiah. Hezekiah had an opportunity to talk to those emissaries who were interested. I mean, he didn't have to go to Babylon and put up his advertisements, and pass out invitations to an evangelistic meeting. Babylon had sent inquirers. What a chance. Here are people knocking on the doors of the General Conference in Tacoma Park. Tell us about this marvelous thing. And instead of telling them about God, we take them through the treasury. And all they did was take notes. It would be worth coming back to get it all. And so do read the story in Chronicles. Hezekiah made a very serious mistake. Do we ever make the same mistake? Do we point to material things and to numbers and all the rest of it as if that's the message? You see, in a way, that's saying, look how wonderfully things are going for me. Is the good news about us, or even about how well we're doing, or is it about God? And Hezekiah never told them about God. He told them about, true, how God had blessed them. But it was primarily as if the good news was, see how God is blessing us, his chosen people. And it makes me think of that advertisement that appeared in the Reader's Digest. That was all about us. And it's true, it's wonderful how the Lord has blessed us, but that's not the good news. The good news is that God would be so gracious as to bless even us. Because we've disappointed him in many ways. And so people could notice all the flaws they find among God's people on this planet today. And you could say, don't be disturbed by that. As a matter of fact, the worse we have behaved, the more graciously God has treated us. Now, don't take that to mean that we're going to behave worse and worse, so he'll look better and better. Paul dealt with that in Romans, you remember. But in spite of our bad behavior, which is inexcusable, how graciously God has treated us, and the emphasis is clear, we want them to know about God, not about us, or even how much he's blessed us. So I was so pleased for that ad that appeared a little later in the TV guide, that we want to be known as people helping people come to know God. And Hezekiah missed it. And there is an interesting parallel, but the details are more explicit in the book to come for next time, in Chronicles. Well, there's one more thing, but we could save it for next time, Manasseh. That's so impressive in here. 50 years a wicked king, and he repented in the end. Note the description, both in Kings and Chronicles, of the genuineness of his repentance. Can one be that wicked so long and still come back? Yeah, but don't count on it. If Manasseh could come back after 50 years, I guess we could be lax for 50 years and still make it. Not everybody came back. His is an extraordinary exception. He came back in the end. But do you notice when he came back, he could not recover his influence. He tried to help his son. He couldn't help his son. Solomon couldn't help his son. David couldn't help his very much. There is a loss even though we're forgiven. But Manasseh apparently is forgiven, and we expect to see him in the kingdom. And one of the last things he did was to put Isaiah in a hollow log and saw him in half. And so, imagining it as children can, it's a shame to lose that ability to imagine things vividly, or else the descriptions of heaven aren't very exciting. But if you can take the descriptions and picture it, it's very exciting. The Bible's written that way. So someday Manasseh and Isaiah will meet. And Isaiah doesn't expect to see that wicked king up there. How do you think Isaiah will welcome him when he sees him? And how do you think Manasseh will treat Isaiah when he sees him? Or will they have forgotten it all? I hope it isn't blotted out. Or if they have forgotten, I hope there's a Bible nearby, and somebody can read the story from Kings and Chronicles to them both, And Isaiah will say, Manasseh, I remember very clearly what you did to me. I remember inside that hollow log those last few moments of terror. It was terrible. But I must say, Manasseh, I'm delighted to see you here because you've been forgiven. It wouldn't be enough for me. I'd want to know if Manasseh could be trusted with a sharp saw. Again, that's what I'd want to know. Whether he has a new heart and a right spirit. And that's why the Bible picture of the plan of salvation does not stress forgiveness so much as healing the damage done. a new heart and a right spirit, as in the 51st Psalm. So the Manasseh story could prompt another discussion of that in Chronicles for next time. Our loving Father in heaven, what a marvelous position of advantage we find ourselves in, living down clear at the end of this whole history of the experiment, of this great controversy, long after the answers have all been given, and realizing the rest of the universe is all convinced, and some of us are too. And from this position of vantage, we look back at these stories, and we see thee working with thy people, so reluctant to give them up, running such risks of apparently playing into the hands of the adversary, giving him opportunities to mock thee, and misrepresent and twist these stories as evidence in support of his charges. We thank thee for running the risks. We even thank thee for the she-bears and the thunders of Sinai and the awesome things that had to be done, even the death of Ananias and Sapphira. And if we find that distressing, how much it must have distressed thee, and yet it had to be done. How much we thank thee for the price thou hast paid, the price in risk of being misunderstood, for thou hast indeed been misunderstood by so many of us. Maybe we still do in many respects. And yet how patient thou hast been, and how patient thou still art, as we look through these stories yet one more time. We do welcome the instruction and correction of the same Spirit that inspired our fellow believers in times past to record these stories. The same Spirit that moved Elisha and Isaiah to behave as they did. May he have freedom to work with us and help us interpret these stories aright. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.